There are wounds that steel cannot heal, and loneliness that victory cannot cure. Sir Garran had learned this truth through 15 years of battles that made him a legend and left him utterly alone. The giant knight stood taller than any man. In the kingdom of Aldermore, his scarred hands capable of ending wars. Yet he had never held a woman's hand without her pulling away in fear. When King Aldric offered him land in exchange for marriage, every eligible woman found reasons to be. Elsewhere, every woman except Mira Blackstone, the stonemason's daughter who saw past the armor to the man beneath. But what happens when she discovers the truth about why his heart races when she touches him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Aldermore's lower quarter as Mira Blackstone knelt beside her father's grave, her calloused fingers tracing the intricate stonework she had carved into his headstone 3 winters past. The Celtic knots flowed seamlessly into Rose's symbols of eternal love and remembrance that had taken her months to perfect. Even now, at 32, she could hear his gentle voice coaching her through difficult cuts, teaching her that stone, like people, had hidden grains that determined how they would break or hold. "Patience, little sparrow," he would say, using the pet name that made her smile even in memory. "The stone will tell you its secrets, but only if you listen." Mira had always listened. Perhaps that was why she had never married, despite the steady stream of suitors who had sought her hand over the years. She listened to their words and heard the undertones they did not intend. The merchant's son who spoke of love but calculated her dowry with his eyes. The blacksmith who praised her beauty but winced when she demonstrated her strength. The traveling minstrel who wrote poems about her grace but left town the moment he learned she owned property in her own name. Her father's chisel set lay beside her on the worn leather apron she had inherited along with his workshop. The tools were extensions of her hands now, each one familiar as her own heartbeat. The smallest chisel, barely thicker than a quill, had carved the delicate veining in marble columns for the new cathedral. The heaviest, broad as her palm, had shaped foundation stones that would outlast kingdoms. These tools had built her reputation as the finest stonemason in 3 counties, and they had also built the walls around her heart. The workshop occupied the ground floor of the stone house. Her grandfather had built, with living quarters above, that had housed 3 generations of Blackstone craftsmen. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits above half-finished sculptures and blocks of limestone waiting for her touch. Her apprentice, young Thomas, would arrive soon to help move the larger pieces, but these quiet morning hours belonged to her alone. She was examining a particularly beautiful piece of blue-veined marble when the commotion began in the town square. Voices carried on the crisp autumn air, excited, nervous, speculative. Mira wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, joining the growing crowd gathered around the town crier. "By royal decree of His Majesty King Aldric," the man announced, his voice carrying the authority of the crown, "Sir Garran of Ravenscroft, Knight of the Realm and Defender of the Northern Borders, is hereby granted the fertile lands of Thornwick Valley in exchange for taking a wife before the winter solstice." The crowd erupted in whispers. Thornwick Valley, everyone knew those lands. Rich soil, fresh water, forest thick with game. A prize worthy of the kingdom's greatest warrior. But the condition, the giant knight, taking a wife? Martha the baker laughed, but there was nervousness in her voice. "More likely to take a sword to his wedding bed. I heard he once stared down a charging boar without blinking," added Peter the cooper. What woman would want to wake beside such a man? Mira listened to the speculation with growing unease. Sir Garran's reputation preceded him like a storm cloud 7 feet tall, they said, with scars that mapped every battle from here to the northern wastes. Children whispered that he could crack a man's skull with his bare hands, that his voice could make grown soldiers weep, that he had never smiled in living memory. The stories grew with each telling, until the man became more myth than flesh. But Mira had learned to listen for what was not said. In all the tales of his ferocity, she noticed something curious. Never once had anyone accused him of cruelty toward the innocent. His anger was reserved for enemies of the realm, his violence for those who threatened peace. The refugees from the border wars spoke of him differently than the tavern storytellers. They called him protector, not monster. No woman in her right mind would bind herself to such a creature, declared Agnes the seamstress, and a murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. That evening, Mira sat in her father's old chair by the fireplace, staring into flames that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The chisel set rested on the table beside her, each tool carefully cleaned and arranged as her father had taught her. She thought about the stories people told and the truths they revealed about the tellers, more than their subjects. Her mother had died when Mira was barely walking, leaving her to grow up in a world of men, her father's apprentices, the other craftsmen, the merchants who commissioned their work. She had learned early that strength and gentleness were not opposites, but the most powerful hands could also be the most careful. Her father had wielded hammers that could shatter stone, yet he had bandaged her scraped knees with the tenderness of any mother. Perhaps that was why the stories about Sir Garran stirred something in her chest, a recognition of the loneliness that came with being seen as dangerous when you were simply different. She knew what it felt like to watch people step back when you approached, to see fear in their eyes when you showed your true strength, to go to bed each night wondering if you were meant to walk through life alone. The fire crackled, and Mira made her decision. 3 days later, she stood before the gates of Castle Aldermore, wearing her finest dress, deep blue wool that complemented her dark hair, with sleeves that she had carefully tailored to allow freedom of movement. She had debated whether to hide her calloused hands beneath gloves, but decided against it. If she was going to do this, she would do it honestly. The guards looked surprised when she stated her business, then confused, then concerned enough to summon the captain. Word traveled up the chain of command with unusual speed, and within an hour, Mira found herself in the castle's great hall, facing King Aldric himself. The king was younger than she had expected, perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and the kind of careful bearing that spoke of a man who weighed his words before speaking them. He studied her for a long moment, taking in her practical dress, her uncovered hair, the confident way she met his gaze. "You understand what you are proposing, Miss Blackstone?" His voice was kind but serious. "Sir Garran is not like other men. The stories you have heard, many of them, are true. I understand he is a knight of the realm who has served with honor," Mira replied steadily. "I understand he is being offered land in exchange for marriage, and that no other woman has come forward. I also understand that I am skilled in my trade, own property, and am past the age where I need anyone's permission to make my own choices." A smile tugged at the corner of the king's mouth. "Indeed. And what do you hope to gain from such an arrangement?" Mira had prepared for this question, but now, facing the king's direct gaze, she found herself speaking from the heart, rather than from her rehearsed speech. "Stability, your majesty. Partnership, perhaps even respect, in time. I have no romantic illusions about knights and fair maidens. I seek a practical arrangement with a man who understands duty and honor. And if he refuses you, then I will return to my workshop with my dignity intact, knowing I was brave enough to try." King Aldric nodded slowly. "Sir Garran arrives at sunset. You may wait in the solar if you wish, or return tomorrow. I will wait, your majesty." The solar was a small, comfortable room with tapestries depicting scenes of hunting and harvest. Mira sat by the window, watching the sun sink toward the horizon and trying to quiet the nervous flutter in her chest. She thought of her father's hands guiding hers as she learned to read the grain of the stone, teaching her that every material had its own nature, its own requirements for coaxing out beauty. Perhaps people were not so different dot as twilight painted. The sky in shades of rose and gold. She heard the thunder of hoofbeats in the courtyard below. Her breath caught as she saw him, even at a distance. Sir Garran commanded attention. He sat his destrier with the ease of a man born to the saddle. His massive frame encased in dark mail that had seen countless battles. When he dismounted, she realized the stories had not exaggerated his size. He towered over the stable boys who rushed to tend his horse, his presence seeming to make the very air around him thicker, more charged. But it was the way he moved that caught her attention carefully, deliberately, as if he were constantly aware of his own strength and its potential for harm. When he spoke to the stable master, she saw him lean down to hear the smaller man's words, saw the gentle way he ran his hand along his horse's neck before turning toward the castle. Mira pressed her palm against the cool glass of the window and made a promise to herself. Whatever happened in the next hour, she would meet this man with the same honesty she brought to her stonework. No pretense, no false softness, just the truth of who she was and what she offered. The light was nearly gone when a servant came to escort her to the king's private chamber. As she walked through the corridors of the castle, her footsteps echoing off ancient stones, Mira thought of all the women who might have taken this walk if they had possessed a little more courage. Tonight, she would discover if courage was enough. The king's private chamber was smaller than Mira had expected, warmed by a fire that cast golden light across rich tapestries and well-worn furniture. King Aldric sat behind an oak desk that bore the scars of decades of use, while scribes arranged documents with the careful precision of men who understood that words on parchment could reshape kingdoms. When the heavy door opened and Sir Garran entered, the very air seemed to shift. Mira had thought herself prepared for his size, but seeing him in the confined space made her breath catch. He had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, and when he straightened to his full height, the top of her head would barely reach his shoulder. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, tied back with a leather cord that had seen better days. The mail had been replaced by a simple tunic of deep brown wool, but it could not disguise the breadth of his shoulders or the corded strength of his forearms. It was his face that surprised her most. The stories had spoken of scars, and indeed, a thin white line ran from his left temple to his jaw, while another crossed his throat like a pale necklace. But his features, while stern, held none of the brutality she had been led to expect. His eyes, dark as winter storm clouds, moved to her with a wariness that seemed more weary than threatening. "Your Majesty," Garran said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. He bowed with the fluid grace of a trained warrior, then straightened and waited with the patience of a man accustomed to following orders. "Sir Garran," the king said warmly, "I present Miss Mira Blackstone of the Stonemasons' Guild. She has come forward regarding your arrangement." Those storm-gray eyes turned to her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Up close, she could see exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of too many battles and too little rest. When he looked at her, she felt assessed, not in the calculating way of her previous suitors, but with the careful attention of a man trying to understand something that puzzled him. "Miss Blackstone," he said, and her name sounded different in his deep voice, more substantial somehow. "You understand the terms of this arrangement?" "I do." She was proud that her voice remained steady despite the way his presence seemed to fill the room. He studied her for another long moment, taking in her practical dress, her uncovered hair, the way she met his gaze without flinching. "You know what manner of man I am. I know you are a knight who has served his king with honor. I know you have been offered land in exchange for marriage. Beyond that, I prefer to form my own opinions." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the faintest hint of interest. "The stories," Stories grow in the telling. Mira interrupted gently. I am more interested in the truth. King Aldric cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the formal proceedings. The contract is straightforward, he said, lifting a document heavy with seals and ribbons. Sir Garran will receive title to Thornwick Valley and its associated lands upon his marriage. The union must be witnessed and blessed by the Church, and must be maintained for a period of no less than 1 year to ensure the validity of the grant. He looked between them, his expression serious. However, given the unique circumstances, I want to be certain both parties understand what they are undertaking. Sir Garran, do you have any objections to Miss Blackstone as your bride? Garran's gaze returned to Mira, and she saw him struggle with something internal. When he spoke, his words were carefully chosen. Miss Blackstone appears to be a woman of character and intelligence, but she may not understand. He stopped, jaw working as if the words were difficult to form. I'm not a man suited to marriage. The stories you dismiss speak the truths about my nature that you might find difficult to live with. What truths? Mira asked, stepping closer despite the way his massive frame dwarfed her own. That you are strong? That you have fought to protect this kingdom? That you prefer solitude to society? That I am cursed, he said quietly, and for the first time, she heard something vulnerable beneath the controlled surface of his voice. The word hung in the air between them like a blade. Mira felt her heart clench at the resigned way he spoke it, as if it were simply an accepted fact of his existence. Cursed how? She asked, ignoring the sharp intake of breath from one of the scribes. Garran glanced at the king, who nodded encouragingly. Women find my presence disturbing, uncomfortable. They sense something in me that drives them away, something that makes them fearful, even when I mean no harm. His hands, Mira noticed, were clenched at his sides. You may be brave enough to stand here now, but in time, you will feel it too. The unease, the need to flee. Mira considered this, studying his face with the same attention she gave to a piece of stone before beginning work. She saw the way he held himself apart, the careful control in every gesture, the expectation of rejection in the set of his shoulders. May I ask you something, Sir Garran? He nodded. The wariness had crept back into his expression. When did you first notice this effect you have on women? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He thought for a moment, his brow furrowing. I was perhaps 16. A maid in my father's house, she had been kind to me as a child, but suddenly she could not bear to be in the same room. She would pale and make excuses to leave whenever I appeared. And you were 16 when you began your knight's training? Yes, but I fail to see you were growing into your size, learning to fight, becoming dangerous whether you wished to or not. Mira took another step closer, and she saw his breath catch. Perhaps what they sensed was not a curse, but simply the reality of what you could do if you chose to. The way a mouse senses a hawk, even a hawk that means it no harm. Garran stared at her, something shifting in his expression. You believe it is merely fear of my strength. I believe, Mira said carefully, that people often sense power in others, and power can be frightening when it's unfamiliar. But some of us are drawn to strength rather than repelled by it, especially when that strength is leashed by honor. She extended her hand toward him, palm up, offering rather than demanding. May I? He looked at her outstretched hand as if it were a viper, his entire body going rigid. Miss Blackstone, I would not advise. Please. The single word, spoken softly, seemed to undo something in him. Slowly, as if approaching a skittish horse, he lifted his own hand. His fingers, scarred and calloused from years of sword work, hovered just above her palm. You should know, he said quietly, that when women touch me, my heart. He stopped, color rising in his cheeks. It races violently. They can feel it, and it frightens them. Mira smiled, the first genuine smile. she had given since entering the castle. Perhaps your heart knows something your mind has not yet accepted. Before he could withdraw, she closed the distance between their hands, her palm settling against his. The contrast was startling. Her hand disappeared entirely within his much larger one, her pale skin a stark counterpoint to his weathered tan. She felt the roughness of old sword calluses, the ridge of a scar across his knuckles, the surprising warmth of his flesh. And yes, she felt his heart racing. The pulse thundered against her fingertips where her wrist pressed against his, rapid and strong as a war drum. But where other women had apparently found this alarming, Mira found it fascinating. This massive, controlled man who could probably crush her bones without effort was affected by her touch to the point where his body betrayed him completely. "Your heart does race," she said softly, not pulling away. "But perhaps not for the reasons you think." Garran was staring down at their joined hands with an expression of wonder that transformed his harsh features entirely. "You are not afraid. Should I be? Every other woman? I am not every other woman." She turned their hands so that her fingers could trace the scar across his knuckles, watching his breath catch at the gentle touch. "I am Mira Blackstone, daughter of stone and earth, and I know the difference between strength that destroys and strength that protects." King Aldric cleared his throat again, but there was warmth in his voice when he spoke. "I take it there are no objections to the match?" Garran's eyes never left Mira's face. "None from me, your majesty, if Miss Blackstone is certain of her choice." "I am certain," Mira said, though her heart was beating nearly as fast as his now. "When shall we wed?" "The banns must be posted," one of the scribes interjected. 3 weeks is traditional." 2 weeks, Garran said firmly. "If we are to do this, let us not draw it out unnecessarily." Mira nodded her agreement, though she was suddenly aware of how much her life was about to change. In 2 weeks, she would be the wife of a man she had known for less than an hour, bound to him by law and custom, sharing his home and his bed. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it sent a thrill of anticipation through her veins. The contracts were signed with appropriate ceremony, witnessed by the scribes and sealed with the king's own ring. When it was done, Garran walked her to the castle gates, moving with that careful, controlled grace she was beginning to recognize as habitual rather than natural. "You may change your mind," he said as they paused beneath the torchlit archway. "Even after the banns are posted, even on the church steps. I would not hold you to this if you realize you have made an error." Mira looked up at him, this giant of a man who expected rejection so completely that he was already providing her with escape routes. "And if you change your mind? If you decide I am not suitable after all?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been hope. "I do not think that likely, Miss Blackstone. You are not what I expected." "Nor are you," she admitted. "I expected someone harder, more frightening." "Give it time," he said with bitter humor. "The curse has not yet had opportunity to work upon you." Mira stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face clearly. "There is no curse, Sir Garran. There is only a man who has been alone so long he has forgotten how to believe in anything else." She rose on her toes and, before she could lose her courage, pressed a soft kiss to his scarred cheek. His sharp intake of breath was audible, and when she settled back on her heels, she saw that he had gone completely still. 2 weeks, she said softly. "I will see you at the altar." As she walked away into the night, she heard him whisper something behind her, too low for her to make out the words. But she did not need to hear them to understand their meaning. For the first time in his adult life, Sir Garran of Ravenscroft was beginning to hope. The wedding had been a simple affair, conducted in the village church with only the required witnesses present. Mira had worn her mother's dress, altered to fit her frame, while Garran stood beside her in his finest doublet, looking as uncomfortable as a man facing execution. When the priest asked if anyone objected to the union, the silence had stretched so long that Mira wondered if someone might actually speak. No one had, though she caught several meaningful glances exchanged among the handful of guests. Now, 3 days later, she stood in the courtyard of what was to be her new home, trying not to show her intimidation at the sheer size of Ravenscroft Keep. The fortress rose from the hillside like something carved from the mountain itself, all gray stone, and narrow windows with towers that seemed to scrape the belly of the clouds. It looked exactly like the sort of place where a giant knight would live, imposing, defensive, and utterly without warmth. "It is not much to look at," Garran said beside her, his voice carefully neutral. He had barely spoken during the ride. From the village, though she had caught him glancing at her several times when he thought she was not looking. "The stonework is excellent," Mira replied truthfully, running her gaze over the fitted blocks and graceful arches. "Whoever built this knew their craft. My grandfather. He believed a man's home should reflect his nature." Mira looked up at him, noting the way his jaw had tightened. "And what nature would that be?" "Hard, unyielding, built to keep the world at bay." She studied his profile, this man who was now her husband, and saw the resignation there. Perhaps it was built to keep something precious safe. Garran's head turned toward her sharply, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked. She saw surprise in his eyes, and beneath it, something that looked dangerously like hope. The interior of the keep proved to be as austere as its exterior suggested. The great hall stretched the length of the building, dominated by a massive hearth that could have housed a small cottage. Tapestries hung from the walls, their colors faded with age, depicting scenes of battle and hunt. The furniture was solid and practical oak tables that could seat a small army, chairs built to accommodate a man of Garran's size, everything designed for function rather than comfort. "The servants will see to your belongings," Garran said, gesturing to the handful of people who had emerged to greet them. An elderly man with kind eyes and silver hair stepped forward, offering a respectful bow. "My lady," he said warmly, "I am Willem, the seneschal. We are honored to welcome you to Ravenscroft." "Thank you, Willem," Mira replied, noting the genuine pleasure in his voice. Whatever the villagers thought of their lord, his household staff seemed genuinely fond of him. "And this is Meredith," Willem continued, indicating a woman of middle years with flour dusting her apron. "She manages the kitchens and has been fretting about your arrival for days." Meredith curtsied, her round face creased with worry. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but we were not certain of your preferences. The master," she glanced at Garran nervously. "That is, his lordship has simple tastes." Mira looked around the sparse hall and understood immediately what the woman meant. This was not a home. It was a barracks with pretensions. "Perhaps you could show me the kitchens later? I would like to understand how the household runs." The relief on Meredith's face was palpable. "Of course, my lady. Would you prefer to dine in the solar tonight? More intimate than the great hall." "The great hall will be fine," Garran interrupted, his voice gruff. "No need to change arrangements on my account." Mira glanced at him, noting the way he avoided eye contact when he spoke. "Actually, I think the solar sounds lovely. If it would not be too much trouble?" "No trouble at all, my lady," Meredith beamed. "I will see to it immediately." As the servants dispersed to their duties, an uncomfortable silence settled between the newlyweds. Garran stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture rigid, while Mira examined her surroundings with the eye of someone trying to understand her new circumstances. "Would you like to see the rest of the keep?" he asked finally, the words coming out stilted and formal. "I would, thank you." He led her through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced men who shared his dark coloring and impressive stature. The Ravenscroft men, she realized, had been giants for generations. They passed armories filled with weapons kept in pristine condition, libraries with books that looked rarely disturbed, and chambers that seemed designed more for defense than daily living. "This will be your solar," Garran said, opening the door to a room that caught the afternoon light through tall windows. It was the first space in the keep that felt remotely welcoming, with comfortable chairs arranged near the fireplace and shelves that could house books or personal treasures. "It is beautiful," Mira said, and meant it. The room had good bones, excellent stonework, proportions that pleased the eye, potential that waited to be realized. "And your chambers are through here." He opened another door to reveal a bedroom. That took her breath away. The space was enormous, dominated by a bed that could have slept 6 people comfortably. Heavy curtains hung from the posts, and a fire crackled in yet another massive hearth. But it was the view that caught her attention, windows that looked out over rolling hills and distant forests, the lands that would soon belong to them both. "The view is magnificent," she said softly. "My chambers are across the hall," Garran said quickly, as if he needed to establish the sleeping arrangements immediately. "I did not want you to feel pressured by our arrangement." Mira turned to study his face, seeing the careful way he held himself apart, even in the intimacy of what was meant to be their shared space. "That is very considerate," he nodded once. "Sharp and military. Is there anything else you need to see?" "Actually, yes. I would like to see your workshop." "My workshop? You must have one. A place where you maintain your weapons, perhaps work with your hands." "Every man needs such a space." Garran looked genuinely puzzled. "I have an armory, but I would not call it a workshop." "Show me." The armory was exactly what she had expected: racks of swords, stands holding pieces of armor, workbenches equipped with the tools necessary to maintain a knight's equipment. But it was clearly utilitarian, lacking the personal touches that would make it a sanctuary. "This is where you spend your time when you are not fighting?" she asked. "I read sometimes." "Or walk the walls." Mira nodded, beginning to understand the shape of her new husband's life. He existed rather than lived, moving through the motions of daily routine without joy or personal investment. The keep was not a home but a fortress against the world, and he was its sole lonely defender. That evening, they dined in the solar as she had requested. Meredith had outdone herself, preparing a meal that managed to be both elegant and comforting. Roasted fowl with herbs from the castle garden, fresh bread still warm from the ovens, vegetables that had clearly been chosen for color as well as taste. Candles provided warm light, and someone had arranged autumn flowers in a simple clay vessel. "This is lovely," Mira said, as they took their seats at a small table that had been brought in for the occasion. "Much more pleasant than rattling around that enormous hall." Garran looked around the transformed solar with something approaching wonder. "I had not thought, that is, I rarely dine anywhere but the great hall. Even when you eat alone?" "Especially then." Mira cut a piece of the tender fowl, savoring the blend of herbs and spices. "Meredith is an excellent cook. You are fortunate to have her. She came with the keep when I inherited it. My father's old nurse, actually. I believe she feels responsible for me." There was warmth in his voice when he spoke of the older woman, a softness that transformed his features entirely. Mira filed this information away, beginning to map the territories of her husband's heart. "Tell me about your father," she said gently. Garran's expression shuddered immediately. "There is little to tell. He was a knight, as his father before him. He died when I was 20, in the border wars. Were you close? We understood each other." The careful phrasing told her more than a longer explanation might have. They had been alike. These Ravenscroft men-giants in a world that found them useful but not particularly welcome, bound by duty and the honor to serve a kingdom that kept them at arm's length. "What about your mother?" "She died birthing me." The flat way he said it told her This was a wound that had never properly healed. How many times, she wondered, had he been reminded that his very existence had cost a life? How many subtle and not-so-subtle suggestions had he received that he was somehow to blame for his mother's death? "I am sorry," she said simply. That must have been difficult, growing up without her. Garran's fork paused halfway to his mouth. He stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to parse some hidden meaning in her words. "Most people express condolences about my father. Your father died a knight's death, serving his king. That is tragic, but it is also honorable. Losing a mother you never knew, that is a different kind of loss entirely." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful armor he wore even in private. "I used to wonder what she would have thought of me, whether she would have been proud or disappointed. What mother would be disappointed in a son who became a knight of the realm? One who hoped for a child who could move through the world without frightening people." The pain in his voice made her chest tighten. Without thinking, she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. The simple gesture seemed to shock him into stillness. "You do not frighten me," she said firmly. "Yet, ever." They sat in silence, her small hand resting on his much larger one, while the candles burned lower and the fire settled into glowing coals. Mira could feel his pulse beneath her fingertips, steady and strong, and she wondered if he could feel hers racing in response. "Why did you truly agree to this arrangement?" Garran asked suddenly. "You could have any man in the kingdom. Why choose someone like me?" Mira considered her answer carefully. The truth was complex, layered with her own loneliness and her recognition of something in him that called to her deepest instincts. But she sensed he was not ready for such revelations. "Because," she said finally, "I believe in second chances. And I think you need someone who sees past the armor to the man underneath." Garran's hand turned beneath hers, his palm settling against her palm in an echo of their first meeting. "And what do you see when you look at me? A man who has spent his life protecting others and never learned how to protect himself." The words hung between them, weighted with truth and possibility. When Garran finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "I do not know how to be a husband, Mira. I have no experience with gentleness or domestic harmony. My skills lie in warfare and solitude. Then perhaps it is fortunate that I am skilled in shaping rough materials into something beautiful." He almost smiled at that. She saw the ghost of it at the corners of his mouth before his habitual reserve reasserted itself. But it was a beginning, she thought. A crack in the stone that, with patience and care, might be widened into something approaching happiness. Later, as she prepared for bed in her magnificent chamber, Mira reflected on the day's revelations. She had married a man who was far more damaged than she had initially realized, but also far more worthy of healing. The keep that surrounded them might be cold and defensive, but it could be warmed with time and effort. As she settled beneath covers that smelled of lavender and sunshine, she heard the measured tread of boots in the corridor outside. Garran making his nightly rounds, checking locks and testing defenses even in his own home. The sound was oddly comforting, the footsteps of a protector ensuring the safety of those in his care. For the first time in years, Mira fell asleep feeling completely secure. She woke before dawn to the sound of steel ringing against steel. The clash of weapons drew her to the window, where she looked down into the courtyard to see Garran practicing with his sword. Even from this distance, she could appreciate the deadly grace of his movements, the way he flowed from one position to another with the fluid precision of a master craftsman. He wore only a simple tunic and leather breeches, his hair tied back to keep it from his eyes. Without the bulk of armor, she could see the true lines of his body, the broad shoulders and narrow waist, the powerful muscles that moved beneath fabric with each controlled strike and parry. He was fighting shadows, she realized, working through complex sequences against imaginary opponents with the kind of focused intensity that spoke of years of disciplined practice. There was something mesmerizing about watching him, something that made her feel like an intruder witnessing a private ritual. This was how he began each day. She suspected not with prayer or contemplation, but with the reminder of what he was capable of, what the world expected from him. When he finally sheathed his sword and turned toward the keep, she stepped back from the window, not wanting him to see her watching. But she had learned something important about her husband in those stolen minutes. Beneath the careful control and painful politeness, Sir Garran of Ravenscroft was a warrior to his very bones. And no amount of gentle domesticity would change that fundamental truth. The question was whether she could love a man whose first instinct would always be to reach for a sword. Breakfast was served in the solar again, another small concession to her preferences that she suspected had required more effort from him than he would admit. Garran appeared freshly washed and dressed, showing no signs of his dawn exertions beyond a slight flush to his cheeks that might have been from the cool morning air. "Did you sleep well?" he asked as they took their seats, the question carefully polite. "Very well, thank you. The bed is quite comfortable." She paused, then added with studied casualness, "I heard you practicing this morning. You are very skilled." His fork stopped halfway to his mouth, and she saw wariness creep into his expression. "I apologize if I woke you. I will train elsewhere in future. You did not wake me, and there is no need to change your routine on my account." "It is your home, our home," she corrected herself. "I simply meant to compliment your skill. My father always said you could judge a craftsman by how he practiced his trade when no one was watching. And what did you judge from watching me?" The question was asked lightly, but she sensed the weight behind it. "That you are a man who takes his responsibilities seriously. That you understand the difference between being deadly and being reckless. That your reputation as a warrior is well earned." Garran set down his fork entirely, studying her face with those storm-gray eyes. "Most women find my skills disturbing." "I am not most women." "No," he said quietly. "You are not." They finished breakfast in companionable silence, and afterward, Garran offered to show her the grounds. The keep sat on a natural rise overlooking a valley that would soon be theirs, connected to the main structure by a series of courtyards and outbuildings that housed everything from stables to workshops, to the quarters where the small garrison lived. "How many men do you keep here?" Mira asked as they passed the barracks. 12, usually. Enough to maintain security, but not so many as to strain resources. Most are veterans of the border wars who prefer steady employment to wandering. Men like yourself. Men who understand that some battles never truly end." There was something in his voice that made her glance at him sharply, but his expression remained neutral. They walked on, Garran pointing out various features of the keep's defenses with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing the weather. Here was where archers could command the approach road. There was the sally port that allowed defenders to launch surprise attacks. This wall could withstand siege engines. That gate could be barred against cavalry charges. It occurred to Mira that her husband viewed the world as a constant threat to be defended against. Even in his own home, surrounded by his own people, he was perpetually preparing for the next attack. When was the last time Ravenscroft was actually threatened? She asked. Garran considered this. Not in my lifetime. Perhaps not in my father's either, but the defenses remained sound. Of course they do. They climbed to the top of the highest tower where the wind caught at Mira's skirts and sent her hair streaming behind her. From this vantage point, she could see for miles in every direction. The village nestled in the valley below, the roads that connected their lands to the wider kingdom, the forests and streams that made Thornwick Valley so valuable. "It is beautiful," she said, genuinely moved by the sweeping vista. "It will be ours soon," Garran replied, and she heard something like wonder in his voice. I have fought for other men's lands my entire adult life. To have my own, to have our own, she corrected. Gently, he turned to look at her, the wind whipping his dark hair across his forehead. You truly mean that? This arrangement we have made, you intend to honor it fully. Did you think I would not? I thought you might come to your senses. Mira stepped closer to him, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to see his face. Clearly, the wind that had seemed merely brisk at ground level was fierce up here, threatening to steal her words before they could reach him. I gave you my word, Garran. In the church, before God and witnesses, that means something to me. Even if you discover that I am everything the stories claim, especially then. She saw his throat work as he swallowed, saw the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. You do not understand what you are saying. Then help me understand. For a moment, she thought he might actually do it, might finally explain the demons that haunted him so completely. But then the moment passed and his expression shuddered closed again. Perhaps we should return. The wind is growing cold. As they descended the winding stairs, Mira found herself studying the man she had married with new eyes. He was like his keep, she realized, built to withstand siege, designed to keep the world at bay, magnificent in its defensive capabilities, but almost impossible to truly enter. The question was whether she had the patience to find the hidden door, the single point of entry that would allow her past his walls. Standing in the courtyard where she had first seen him practice, watching him bid polite farewell before disappearing into his armory to tend his weapons, Mira made a decision. She would not simply wait for him to let her in. Like any skilled craftsman, she would study her materials, learn their properties, and then apply the right pressure in the right places, until something beautiful emerged from the raw stone of their marriage. After all, she had not won her father's chisel set by accepting that some stones were too hard to carve. The library became Mira's refuge during the long afternoons when Garran disappeared into his routines of maintenance and patrol. The room stretched the length of the keep's eastern wall, its shelves filled with volumes that spoke to generations of scholarly pursuits. She found treatises on warfare and statcraft alongside works of philosophy and poetry. The collection of men who had been warriors, but also thinkers dot. It was while exploring these shelves that she discovered Garran's reading chair, a massive piece of furniture covered in worn leather that had been shaped by years of use. The arms bore the impressions of strong hands, and a small table beside it held a collection of books that had clearly been read and reread, until their pages were soft with handling dot. The title surprised her. She had expected military histories or accounts of famous battles. Instead, she found poetry works by troubadours who wrote of courtly love and chivalrous devotion, philosophers who pondered the nature of human connection, even a slim volume of fairy tales that looked as though it had been cherished since childhood. Those were my mother's. Garran's voice came from behind her, making her start. She had not heard him enter, though she should have known better by now than to assume she could move through his keep unobserved. I am sorry, she said, setting down the book of fairy tales with careful hands. I was exploring and did not mean to intrude on something private. You are not intruding. The library belongs to the house, and you are lady of this house now. He moved to stand beside her, his presence filling the space between the shelves. She was a romantic, according to my father. She believed in true love and happy endings. And what do you believe in? Garran was quiet for so long that Mira thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I used to believe in duty, honor, the idea that if a man served faithfully and protected the innocent, he might earn some measure of peace. He paused, his fingers brushing the spine of the fairy tale collection. Now, I am not certain what I believe. Mira turned to face him fully, studying the careful control in his expression that could not quite hide the vulnerability beneath. What changed? You. The single word hung between them, weighted with implications that made her breath catch. She saw him realize what he had revealed, saw him begin to retreat behind his walls of careful politeness. "That is," he said quickly, "the arrangement we have made has required me to reconsider certain assumptions about my future." "What assumptions?" "That I would live and die alone. That marriage was not a possibility for someone of my nature. That hope was a luxury I could not afford." Mira felt her heart clench at the resigned way he spoke, as if loneliness were simply another piece of armor he had learned to wear. She thought of him reading his mother's fairy tales in this vast, empty library, surrounded by stories of love and connection while believing himself incapable of either. "May I ask you something?" she said softly. He nodded. The wariness had crept back into his expression. "When you read these books, your mother's books, what do you feel?" Garran's jaw worked as if the question physically pained him. "Longing," he admitted finally, "and shame." "Shame?" "A man of my size and nature, dreaming of gentle words and tender touches, it is ridiculous. It is human." The words came out more forcefully than she had intended, and she saw him flinch at her vehemence. She gentled her voice, stepping closer until she was near enough to touch him if she chose. "Garran, there is nothing shameful about wanting to be loved. Nothing ridiculous about hoping for tenderness. The fact that you are large and strong does not mean you are not entitled to the same feelings as any other man. Other men do not make. Women flee in terror. Other men do not inspire the same intensity of feeling that you do." He stared at her, something shifting in his expression. "What do you mean?" Mira chose her words carefully, knowing she was approaching dangerous territory. "You said that women sense something in you that makes them uncomfortable. But what if it is not discomfort they feel? What if it is simply ... intensity? The recognition that you are not a man who does anything by halves, including caring for someone? I do not understand." "Your heart races when you touch me," she said, taking the final step that brought her within arm's reach. "Not because you are cursed, but because you feel things deeply, completely, and that depth of feeling is overwhelming to people who are not prepared for it." Garran's breathing had grown shallow, as she could see the pulse beating rapidly in his throat. "Mira, I am prepared for it," she continued, reaching up to place her palm against his chest, where his heart hammered beneath the fabric of his tunic. "I am not afraid of the strength of your feelings, because I understand that such strength, properly directed, is not a curse but a gift. You cannot know that. You cannot know what I am capable of feeling. Then show me." The challenge hung between them, and Mira saw the exact moment when his careful control began to crumble. His hands came up to cup her face, his touch gentle, despite the tremor she could feel in his fingers. "If I show you," he said quietly, "if I let you see what lies beneath all this careful civility, you may find that you have made a terrible mistake. Or I may find that I have married exactly the man I hoped I was marrying." Something broke in his expression then, some final wall crumbling under the pressure of hope too long denied. When he bent his head to kiss her, it was with a reverence that took her breath away, as if she were something precious that might shatter if he was not infinitely careful. But Mira was not made of glass, and she had not married him to be treated like a delicate flower. When she kissed him back with equal fervor, pressing herself against the solid warmth of his body, she felt him shudder with the force of his response. "Mira," he breathed against her lips, her name a prayer and a plea all at once. "I am here," she whispered back. "I am not going anywhere." When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garran rested his forehead against hers with a shaky exhale. "I do not know how to do this," he admitted. "How to be a husband to someone like you. Someone like me? Someone good? Someone deserving of gentleness." Mira's heart broke a little at the way he said it, as if goodness were a foreign concept, and gentleness something he had no right to expect. Then perhaps, she said softly, we can learn together. That evening, they dined in the great hall for the first time since her arrival. Garran had suggested it almost shyly, as if expecting her to refuse, but Mira had agreed readily. The enormous space felt less intimidating with the two of them at one end of the long table, candles pushing back the shadows and conversation making the stone walls seem less forbidding. "Tell me about your work," Garran said as they shared a bottle of wine that Willem had produced from some hidden cache. "What drew you to stonework?" Mira smiled, warming to the subject. "My father, originally. But even as a child, I loved the idea that you could take something rough and formless and shape it into something beautiful and lasting. Stone endures in a way that few things do. Like this keep, exactly. Your grandfather built these walls to last centuries, and they have. Long after we are gone, they will still stand." Garran considered this, swirling wine in his goblet. "I have never thought of my work in those terms. Battles end, but their consequences fade with time. What lasting thing have I built? Peace," Mira said without hesitation. "Safety for those who cannot protect themselves. The knowledge that the kingdom's borders are secure because men like you stand watch. But when I am gone, others will take your place, trained by your example, inspired by your dedication. You may not build in stone, but you build in something just as permanent. The security that allows families to sleep safely, children to grow up without fear, craftsmen to practice their trades in peace." She saw the way her words affected him, the gradual straightening of his shoulders and lifting of his chin. For too long, she realized, he had seen himself as nothing more than a weapon to be pointed at the kingdom's enemies. The idea that his service had created something lasting and valuable had never occurred to him. "You have a gift for seeing the best in things," he said finally. "I have a gift for seeing what is actually there, rather than what people assume is there." "And what do you see when you look at me?" The question was asked quietly, but Mira heard the importance of it in his voice. This was not idle curiosity, but a genuine need to understand how she perceived him. "I see a man who has spent his life serving others at great personal cost," she said carefully. "Someone who has been so focused on being what the kingdom needed that he has forgotten to be what he needed. I see strength that has never been allowed to be gentle, intelligence that has been channeled only toward warfare, and a capacity for feeling that has been buried so deep you have almost convinced yourself it does not exist." Garran set down his goblet with hands that trembled slightly. "And you believe all of that can be recovered?" "I believe it never went anywhere. It has simply been waiting for someone who could see it clearly enough to call it forth." The silence that followed was charged with possibility, with the kind of potential that made Mira's pulse quicken in anticipation. When Garran finally spoke, his voice was rougher than usual. "I would like to try," he said, "to be the man you seem to think I can be." "You already are that man," Mira replied. "You just need to give yourself permission to believe it." Later, as they climbed the stairs together to retire for the night, Mira felt the weight of progress made and challenges yet to come. At her chamber door, Garran paused, clearly wrestling with some internal debate. "Would you—" he began, then stopped. "That is, if you would not find it presumptuous, what is it? Would you like to share breakfast in the gardens tomorrow? The weather has been fine, and there is a place that catches the morning sun. I would love that." Mira interrupted gently, touched by his uncertainty over such a simple request. The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise after a long night, bright and warming and full of promise. "Then I will make the arrangements." As she prepared for bed, Mira reflected on the day's revelations. Her husband was not the cold, cursed creature of reputation, but a man who felt too much and had been taught to hide it all. Like stone waiting for a sculptor's touch, he needed only patience and skill to reveal the beauty that lay beneath the rough exterior. She fell asleep thinking of fairy tales, and the men brave enough to believe in happy endings. The garden breakfast had become a treasured ritual over the past week, a daily hour when the rest of the world seemed to fade away and leave only the two of them in the morning sunlight. Mira had grown to love these quiet moments, watching Garran slowly relax as they shared simple meals surrounded by the herbs and flowers that Meredith tended with such care. Today, however, something was different. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and the air carried the electric tension that preceded autumn tempests. Garran had been quieter than usual, his responses to her conversation distracted, his gaze frequently turning toward the darkening sky. "The weather is turning," he said, as the first fat raindrops began to fall. "We should go inside." But even as they gathered the breakfast dishes and hurried toward the keep, Mira could see that his agitation had nothing to do with getting wet. His jaw was tight with tension, and there was something almost frantic in the way he moved, as if the approaching storm had awakened some deep unease within him. By midday, the tempest had arrived in earnest. Wind howled around the keep's towers, driving rain against the windows with enough force to rattle the glass. Thunder rolled across the sky like the footsteps of giants, and lightning illuminated the great hall in stark, momentary brilliance. Mira found herself drawn to the windows, fascinated by the raw power of nature unleashed. She had always loved storms, the way they cleared the air and washed the world clean, the reminder that there were forces beyond human control that demanded respect rather than fear. But when she looked for Garran, she found his chair by the hearth empty, though she was certain he had been there only moments before. "Willem," she called to the seneschal, who was directing servants in closing shutters against the wind. "Where is my husband?" "Gone to check the battlements, my lady." Willem replied, but there was something troubled in his expression. He always does when the storms come. Always? Since he was a boy, his lordship has never taken well to thunder. The careful way Willem phrased it told Mira volumes. She thought of the war journal she had glimpsed in Garran's armory, the carefully hidden accounts of battles that had left scars deeper than those visible on his flesh. How many times had he lain in muddy fields while cannon fire split the night? How many comrades had he lost to the thunder of warfare? Another crash of thunder shook the keep, and Mira made her decision. Wrapping herself in a heavy cloak, she climbed the winding stairs to the highest tower, following instinct and the faint sound of pacing footsteps above the storm's roar. She found him on the battlements, soaked to the skin despite the cloak he wore, his hands gripping the stone parapet with white-knuckled intensity. Rain streamed down his face, mixing with what she realized with a shock might be tears. His breathing was harsh and irregular, and his entire body was rigid with barely controlled panic. "Garran!" She called over the wind, but he did not seem to hear her. Lightning split the sky again, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that made the stones beneath their feet vibrate, and she saw him flinch as if struck. "Garran," she said again, moving closer despite the driving rain. "You should not be up here. It is not safe." "Cannot." His voice was broken, barely audible above. "The storm. Cannot breathe in there." Walls closing in, understanding flooded through her. This was not simple discomfort with storms, but something far deeper and more damaging. The thunder that reminded him of artillery, the enclosed spaces that became traps rather than shelter, the need to stand watch even when there was nothing, to defend against all the signs of a warrior's mind struggling to find peace in a world that no longer made sense. "Look at me," she said firmly, reaching out to touch his arm. "Garran, look at me." His eyes found hers, wild and unfocused, and she saw the boy he must have been before war taught him to carry such burdens. Without hesitation, she stepped closer, pressing herself against his side, despite the rain that soaked through her cloak within seconds. "You are safe," she said clearly, her voice carrying the same authority she used when directing workers on a construction site. You are at Ravenscroft Keep. There are no enemies here, no battles to fight. Just a storm that will pass. The thunder is only weather. Not cannon fire, not siege engines. Just wind and rain and lightning that cannot hurt us here. She felt some of the tension leave his body, though he still trembled against her. I know that, he said miserably. In my mind, I know that. But my body? Your body remembers things your mind would prefer to forget. That is not weakness, Garran. That is what happens to people who have seen too much, carried too much, endured too much for the sake of others. Another flash of lightning illuminated his face, and she saw wonder there along with the lingering panic. You are not afraid of me like this. Why would I be afraid? I am not. This is not the man you married. This broken thing that cannot even. This is exactly the man I married, Mira interrupted fiercely. A man who has given everything in service to his kingdom, who has sacrificed his own peace of mind to ensure that others could sleep safely. A man who is strong enough to admit when he is struggling and brave enough to keep standing even when the world feels like it is falling apart around him. Garran stared at her, rain streaming down his face, and she saw the exact moment when something fundamental shifted in his understanding of himself. You mean that? Every word. He pulled her against him then, his arms coming around her with desperate strength, and she felt him shudder as another roll of thunder passed overhead. But this time, he did not flinch away from the sound. Instead, he buried his face in her hair and held on as if she were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. How long? She asked softly. How long have you been fighting this alone? Since the siege of Blackwater, 5 years ago. The bombardment lasted 3 days, and we had no choice but to endure it. Men died all around me, and his voice broke. I lived. I kept giving orders, kept fighting, kept pretending I was not falling apart inside. And when it was over, when we had won, I found that I could not forget the sound. Have you told anyone? Who would I tell? My king needs knights who are strong, not damaged goods who cannot handle a thunderstorm. Mira pulled back far enough to look into his eyes, her hands coming up to frame his face. Your king needs knights who are human, men who understand that. Strength is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to keep going despite it. And your wife needs a husband who trusts her enough to show her his wounds so she can help heal them. You would do that? Help me? I promise to stand beside you. For better or worse. This is part of worse, and I am still here. The storm began to abate as they stood together on the battlements, the thunder growing more distant and the rain softening to a steady patter. Garran's breathing gradually slowed to match hers, and some of the wild desperation faded from his eyes. We should go inside, he said finally. You will catch your death in this weather, only if you come with me. No more standing guard against ghosts. He nodded, and together they made their way down the winding stairs to the warmth and light of the keep below. In their shared solar, Meredith had left thick towels and dry clothes, along with hot spiced wine that steamed in pottery mugs. As they dried themselves and changed into warm garments, Mira felt the significance of what had passed between them. There is something I should tell you, Garran said as they settled before the fire, wine warming their hands and the storm finally moving off toward distant hills. Something about why I truly never married. Mira waited, giving him the space to find his words. It was not just that women found me frightening, he continued. It was that I knew I was damaged in ways that would make me a poor husband. The nightmares, the times when thunder makes me useless, the way I see enemies in every shadow. What woman would want to bind herself to such a broken man? A woman who understands that the best things in life are often the ones that require patience and care to reveal their true beauty. Garran looked at her across the small space between their chairs, and she saw something she had never seen before in his expression. Not just hope, but the beginning of genuine peace. I have never told anyone about Blackwater, he said quietly. I did not think I could bear to see the knowledge in their eyes, the understanding that I am not the invincible knight of legend, but just a man who sometimes cannot stop his hands from shaking. And now? Now I think that perhaps being seen, truly seen by someone who does not turn away, might be worth the risk. Mira set down her wine and moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his scarred hands in her smaller ones. Then let me see all of you. Garran, not just the parts you think are acceptable, but the whole truth of who you are. The warrior and the wounded man, the protector and the one who needs protecting, the legend and the human being who deserves to be loved for exactly what he is. When he bent to kiss her this time, it was with a reverence that spoke of gratitude as much as desire. The kiss of a man who had spent too long believing himself unworthy of gentle treatment. And when the fire burned low and they finally parted to seek their separate chambers, Mira knew that something irrevocable had changed between them. The storm had passed, but in its wake, it had left something precious, the first true intimacy of two people who had seen each other's vulnerabilities and chosen to stay. The morning after the storm dawned clear and bright, the air washed clean and everything touched with the crystalline quality that follows tempests. Mira woke to find a single pressed flower on her bedside table, a late-blooming rose from the garden, its petals carefully preserved between pieces of parchment. No note accompanied it, but none was needed. She understood the gift for what it was, Garran's quiet acknowledgement of what had passed between them, a tangible token of trust freely given. She found him in the armory, as she had expected, tending to weapons that had been dampened by the storm's fury. But there was something different about his movements today, a looseness in his shoulders that spoke of burdens partially lifted. When he looked up at her entrance, she saw none of yesterday's haunted desperation in his eyes. "Good morning," she said softly, holding up the pressed flower. "Thank you for this." Color rose in his cheeks, and she realized she was seeing Garran blush for the first time. It seemed appropriate. Something beautiful preserved against time's passage, like memories of important moments. Exactly like that. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the armory's stone walls warming in the morning light. Mira noticed that several of the weapons showed signs of more than mere maintenance. Tiny scratches had been polished away. Leather fittings had been oiled to supple perfection, and every surface gleamed with the kind of care that spoke of affection rather than duty. "You love them," she said, gesturing to the carefully arranged swords and shields. "They have kept me alive," Garran replied simply. "It seems only proper to show them respect in return. Tell me about this one." She approached a sword that hung in a place of honor, its blade bearing intricate engravings that caught the light like captured starfire. "My father's sword, and his father's before him." Garran lifted it from its hooks with reverent hands, the weight clearly familiar and comforting. The blade was forged 3 generations ago by a master smith who said it would only break when its wielder's honor failed. And it has never broken? Not so much as a nick, though it has been tested more thoroughly than I would prefer. Mira watched the way his hands moved along the blade, checking its edge and balance with the unconscious competence of long practice. "Would you teach me?" Garran's head snapped up, surprise clear in his expression. "Teach you what?" "Sword work. Not to the level of a knight, obviously, but enough to understand what you do, how you think when you fight." "Mira, it is not that is. Women do not typically marry giants either. Yet here we are." She smiled at his flustered expression. "I am not asking to join your garrison or ride to war. I simply want to understand this part of your life, to see the world through your eyes for a little while." Garran considered this, his thumb unconsciously stroking the pommel of his father's sword. "It would not be proper for me to teach you myself. People would talk. Then we will practice privately, where people cannot see us to disapprove." "You," Might be injured. I might be injured crossing the courtyard, but that does not mean I should never leave my chambers." She stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "Please, Garran, let me share this with you." Something in her voice must have convinced him, because he finally nodded slowly. "Very well, but we will start with wooden practice swords, and if you show the slightest sign of discomfort or fatigue, we stop immediately." Agreed. Their first lesson took place that very afternoon in a secluded corner of the lower courtyard, hidden from casual observation by the angle of the walls. Garran had found a practice sword sized more appropriately for her smaller frame, though even that felt heavy and unwieldy in her hands. "The sword is not a club," he said patiently, as she struggled with the basic guards he was trying to teach her. "Do not try to force it. Let it become an extension of your arm." "Easy for you to say," Mira panted, already feeling the burn in her shoulders. "You have been doing this since childhood, which is precisely why I know that frustration is your enemy more than any opponent will be." He moved behind her, his hands covering hers on the sword's hilt. "Feel how the weight wants to move. Work with it, not against it." His closeness was distracting in ways that had nothing to do with sword work. She could feel the warmth of his chest against her back, smell the familiar scent of leather and steel that clung to his clothes. When he adjusted her grip, his fingers lingered longer than strictly necessary, and she heard his breath catch when she unconsciously leaned back against his solid strength. "Like this?" she asked, executing the guard he had shown her with something approaching competence. "Better," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Much better." The lesson continued for another hour, with Garran displaying a patience she had not expected. He corrected her mistakes gently, praised her small victories with genuine warmth, and gradually began to relax into the role of teacher. By the end, Mira was exhausted but exhilarated, her arms aching pleasantly from unaccustomed exercise. "You have natural balance," Garran observed as they put away the practice weapons. "With time and training, you could become quite skilled." High praise from a master swordsman. I do not give false compliments. No, she thought, studying his serious expression. He would not. Garran was too honest for flattery, too honorable for empty words. When he praised her efforts, he meant every syllable. That evening, they dined in the great hall again, the vast space feeling less intimidating now that she understood it was simply another part of Garran's carefully maintained defenses. Over roasted meat and fresh bread, they talked about sword work and strategy, about the differences between training for duels and training for battlefield combat. "You think differently when you fight," Mira observed. "I could see it today, even in such a simple lesson. Your whole demeanor changes. Combat requires complete focus," Garran replied. "There is no room for doubt or distraction when lives hang." "In the balance, is that why you practice alone each morning? To maintain that focus?" "Partly, but also because," he paused, seeming to weigh his words, "because it is the one time each day when I feel completely myself. Not the knight others expect me to be, not the legend or the monster of stories, just me." Mira set down her goblet, struck by the loneliness in his admission. "You could practice with me now. If you wanted company, you would not find it interesting. I am not performing for an audience. I am not an audience, Garran. I am your wife. There is a difference." He looked at her across the table, candlelight playing across his scarred features, and she saw the moment when her words truly sank in. Wife, not observer. Partner, not spectator. Someone who wanted to share his solitude rather than intrude upon it. "Tomorrow morning, then," he said quietly. "If you are certain, I am certain." Later, as they climbed the stairs together, Mira felt the weight of progress made and intimacy earned. At her chamber door, Garran paused as had become his custom, though tonight there was something different in his manner. "Mira," he said softly. What you did yesterday, during the storm, what about it? You did not try to fix me or make the fear go away. You simply stayed. She reached up to touch his cheek, feeling the slight roughness of evening stubble beneath her palm. That is what people do when they care about each other. They stay. I have never had anyone stay before. You have never had a wife before. Garran leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. No, I have not. I am still learning what that means. So am I, Mira admitted. We can learn together. When he kissed. A good night this time. It was with a tenderness that spoke of growing trust and deepening affection. As she prepared for bed, Mira carefully placed the pressed rose in the small jewelry box that had been her mother's, where it would be safe among her most precious possessions. Outside her window, she could hear the measured tread of boots. Garran made his nightly rounds, checking defenses that would likely never be tested. But tonight, the sound did not speak of isolation and duty. Tonight, it sounded like the footsteps of a man who finally had something worth protecting beyond abstract concepts of honor and service. For the first time since their marriage, Mira fell asleep thinking not of the man Garran had been or might become, but of the man he was revealing himself to be layer by careful layer, like a sculpture emerging from rough stone under patient hands. The royal summons arrived on a gray October morning, delivered by a courier who bore the king's seal. And an expression of barely concealed curiosity, Mira watched from the solar window as Garran spoke with the messenger in the courtyard below, noting the way her husband's shoulders tensed as he read the formal parchment. When he joined her for the midday meal, his usual careful composure was strained nearly to breaking. "The king wishes to see us," he said without preamble, setting the summons on the table between them. "Both of us. We are to present ourselves at court within the fortnight." Mira lifted the document, scanning the formal language that could not quite hide an underlying urgency. "It says the matter concerns the validity of our marriage contract." "Political pressure," Garran said grimly. "Someone has convinced His Majesty that our arrangement was made under false pretenses." "What false pretenses?" "That you could not have known what manner of man you were agreeing to wed. That you were deceived about my nature and should be granted an annulment for your own protection." The bitter certainty in his voice told Mira that this was not the first time such questions had been raised about his fitness for marriage. She set down the summons and studied her husband's face, seeing the familiar walls rising behind his eyes. "And you believe they are right?" It was not a question, and Garran's slight flinch confirmed her suspicion. "I believe that you married a man whose reputation preceded him, but you could not have truly understood what that reputation meant for your daily life. Could I not? You have seen me at my weakest broken by thunder, haunted by battles that ended years ago. You have witnessed the damage war leaves on a man's soul. If you wish to petition for annulment on those grounds alone, I would not contest it." Mira felt anger rise in her chest, not at Garran, but at the forces that had conspired to convince him he was unworthy of happiness. "Is that what you want? For me to petition for annulment?" "I want you to be free to choose your own future, unencumbered by a decision you made without full knowledge of its consequences." "I see." She rose from her chair, pacing to the window where she could look out over the lands they had only just begun to call home. "And what of your future, Garran? What of the land you were promised, the home you have built here? There will be other opportunities for advancement. The king is not cruel. The king is being manipulated by people who cannot bear the thought that a woman might choose to bind herself to a man they consider unsuitable." Mira turned back to face him, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "They would rather believe I was deceived or coerced than accept that I saw exactly who you are and chose you anyway." Garran stared at her, clearly taken aback by her vehemence. "Mira, tell me something," she interrupted. "In the weeks since our marriage, have I given you any indication that I am unhappy? That I feel trapped or deceived or coerced. No, but have I shrunk from your touch or shown fear of your presence or expressed regret for the choice I made? No. Have I asked to be released from our vows or suggested that our arrangement is anything other than what I hoped it would be? No, Garran admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Then perhaps you should trust my judgment about my own life and my own heart, rather than assuming that others know better than I do what is good for me. The silence that followed was charged with tension, but it was a different kind of tension than she had grown accustomed to. This was not the wariness of a man expecting rejection, but the startled hope of someone daring to believe in unexpected possibilities. You would fight for our marriage? He asked finally. I would fight for us, Mira corrected. For the right to make our own choices and face the consequences together. For the recognition that love is not always convenient or expected, but it is always worth defending. Love? The word hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Mira felt her heart racing as she realized what she had revealed, but she did not regret the admission. It was true, had been true for weeks, though she had not named it even to herself until this moment. Yes, she said simply. Love. Garran rose from his chair as if in a dream, crossing the space between them with the careful movements of a man afraid to shatter something precious. When he reached her, he stopped just close enough that she could see the wonder and disbelief warring in his expression. You love me, he said, as if testing the words on his tongue. I love your honor and your gentleness. I love your strength and your vulnerability. I love the way you read poetry in secret and press flowers to preserve beautiful moments. I love your patience when you teach me sword work and your fierce protectiveness of those in your care. She reached up to cup his face in her hands, feeling the slight tremor that ran through him at her touch. I love you, Garran of Ravenscroft, exactly as you are, and I will not let anyone convince me that such love is a mistake. I do not deserve. You deserve everything, she said fiercely. Love and happiness, and the knowledge that you are valued for more than your sword arm. You deserve a wife who chooses you freely and fights to keep you. You deserve a future that includes joy as well as duty. When he kissed her this time, it was with a desperation that spoke of years of longing suddenly given permission to exist. Mira felt herself melting against him, her hands fisting in the fabric of his tunic as she kissed him back with equal fervor. This was not the careful, controlled affection of their earlier encounters, but something raw and honest and utterly consuming. I love you too, he whispered against her lips, the words rough with emotion. God help me. I love you so much it terrifies me. Why does it terrify you? Because love makes a man vulnerable. It gives him something to lose that matters more than his own life. And men like me, we are not good at protecting the things we love. Mira pulled back far enough to look into his eyes, seeing the fear there along with the love. You have protected this kingdom for 15 years. You have kept your people safe, defended the innocent, served with honor and distinction. Why would protecting our love be any different? Because kingdoms are abstract. Duty is clear. Love is personal, complicated, worth fighting for even when the odds are against you. Garran nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. Yes, then we fight, Mira said simply. Together, we go to court, we face whatever challenges they present, and we prove that our marriage is valid, not because some contract says it is, but because we choose each other every single day. And if they refuse to accept that, if they dissolve our union anyway, then we will face that together too. But I will not make it easy for them, and I will not pretend that what we have found together is anything less than extraordinary. That evening, as they prepared for the journey to court, Mira found herself in Garran's armory, watching him select and pack the weapons he would carry. The process was methodical, almost ritualistic, each piece chosen for both practical and symbolic purposes. "The ancestral sword?" she asked, noting the way his hand lingered on the engraved blade. "If I am to be judged as a knight, I should appear as one." He lifted the weapon, its weight familiar in his hands. "This sword has defended 3 generations of Ravenscroft honor. Perhaps it will defend one more. And what of this?" Mira reached for something she had noticed tucked discreetly among his traveling gear, an ancient medallion on a chain that looked too delicate for his large hands. Garran's expression shifted, becoming almost vulnerable. "It was my mother's. The only thing of hers that survived her death. I have carried it into every battle, though I have never worn it openly." Mira examined the medallion more closely, noting the intricate knotwork and the small gemstone at its center that seemed to catch light from impossible angles. There was something about it that spoke to her craftsman's eye, a quality of workmanship that suggested it was more than mere jewelry. "It is beautiful," she said softly, "and clearly very old. My father said it was made by the first Lord of Ravenscroft for his bride, who was said to be a woman of unusual gifts. The story goes that she could see the truth of people's hearts, could tell at a glance whether they were worthy of trust or love. What happened to her? She died young, like all the Ravenscroft wives. It is said that the medallion carries something of her gift, though I have never noticed any unusual properties." Mira held the medallion up to catch the lamplight, and for just a moment, she could have sworn she felt warmth pulse through the metal. "Perhaps it simply recognizes truth when it encounters it." "What do you mean?" "Your heart races when you touch me," she said, setting the medallion carefully back among his belongings. "Not because you are cursed, but because some part of you recognizes what we could be together. What if that recognition comes not from curse or coincidence, but from something deeper? Something that runs in your bloodline?" Garran stared at her, his expression shifting through surprise, consideration, and finally something that might have been revelation. "You think the medallion. I think you are descended from people who understood that the heart knows truths the mind has not yet accepted. And I think that whatever gift your ancestors possessed, it lives in you still." As they finished their preparations for the journey to court, Mira felt the weight of mysteries yet to be solved and challenges yet to be faced. But she also felt the strength that came from absolute certainty about her choices and the man she had chosen to share her life. Whatever awaited them at the royal court, they would face it as they had learned to face everything else together, with honesty and courage and the kind of love that refused to be diminished by other people's doubts. The royal court was a world unto itself, all glittering surfaces and hidden currents of power that Mira found far more treacherous than any battlefield Garran had ever described. They had arrived the previous evening to find themselves housed in guest quarters that were elegant but deliberately isolated, as if their very presence might contaminate the more established nobles. Now, standing in the antechamber outside the king's private audience room, Mira could feel the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations that died abruptly whenever she turned her head. The court ladies examined her with calculating eyes, taking note of her simple but well-made gown, her uncovered hair, the way she stood without apology beside her imposing husband. "They are wondering how long you will last," said a voice beside her, and Mira turned to see a woman of perhaps 40 years, elegantly dressed, but with intelligent eyes that held more warmth than judgment. "I beg your pardon?" "The vultures," the woman said with a slight smile, gesturing discreetly toward cluster of richly dressed nobles. "They are making wagers on how quickly you will petition for annulment once you realize what you have gotten yourself into." "And what odds are they giving?" "Lady Cordelia believes you will not last the winter. Lord Ashford gives you until spring, but only because he thinks you are too stubborn to admit defeat quickly." The woman extended her hand in greeting. "I am Lady Margaret Ashworth, by the way, and I have refused to participate in their unseemly gambling." Mira Blackstone, that is, Lady Mira of Ravenscroft. The title still felt foreign on her tongue, though she was growing more comfortable with the reality it represented. Indeed, the stonemason's daughter who captured the heart of the kingdom's most fearsome knight. You have caused quite a stir, my dear. Mira glanced at Garran, who stood slightly apart from the crowd with the rigid posture of a man enduring unwelcome scrutiny. Even in his finest court dress, he looked exactly like what he was, a warrior who would rather face an army than navigate the treacherous waters of political intrigue. Tell me, Lady Margaret continued, what do you make of the rumors? What? Rumors? That your marriage was arranged under false pretenses. That you were deceived about your husband's true nature and should be granted release from vows made in ignorance. Margaret's tone was carefully neutral, but Mira sensed genuine curiosity rather than malicious intent. I would say that anyone who believes such rumors does not know me very well. And yet, here you are, summoned to defend the validity of your union before the king himself. Someone with considerable influence has convinced His Majesty that intervention is necessary. Before Mira could respond, the audience chamber doors opened and a herald announced their names. As they were ushered into the king's presence, Mira felt Garran's tension ratchet higher, his hand unconsciously moving to where his sword would normally hang. King Aldric sat behind a desk heavy with documents, but he was not alone. 3 other figures occupied chairs, arranged in a semicircle, 2 men Mira did not recognize, and a woman whose calculating gaze made her skin crawl. All 3 wore the elaborate dress of high nobility, and all 3 studied the arriving couple, with expressions that ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. Sir Garran, Lady Mira, the king said formally. Please, be seated. They took the chairs that had been placed facing the assembled group, and Mira was struck by how the arrangement felt more like a trial than a friendly audience. Garran sat with military precision, his face carefully neutral, while she forced herself to appear calm despite the way her heart was racing. I have asked you here, King Aldric began, because concerns have been raised about the circumstances surrounding your marriage. Concerns that, if valid, would require me to intervene for the protection of all parties involved. What concerns? Your Majesty? Mira asked before Garran could speak, earning sharp looks from the assembled nobles. The woman with the calculating gaze leaned forward, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I am Lady Rosalind Fairfax, advisor to His Majesty on matters of noble marriages and bloodlines. It has come to our attention that you may have entered into this union without fully understanding the unique challenges of being wed to Sir Garran. What unique challenges would those be, my lady? Please, Lady Mira, interrupted one of the men, his tone patronizing in a way that immediately set her teeth on edge. There is no shame in admitting that you were not prepared for the realities of your situation. Sir Garran's reputation is well known. His difficulties with normal social interaction are documented, and his unsuitability for marriage has been a matter of court discussion for years. Mira felt Garran go rigid beside her, saw his hands clench into fists in his lap. The careful composure he maintained was cracking under the weight of public humiliation, and she realized with sudden clarity that this entire proceeding was designed not to protect her, but to destroy him. I see, she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that her father's apprentices had learned to recognize as a warning. And who, precisely, has been discussing my husband's unsuitability for marriage? Lady Fairfax smiled, with predatory satisfaction. Those of us who have observed his behavior over the years, his inability to maintain normal relationships with women, his violent outbursts during thunderstorms, his general unfitness for the delicate responsibilities of married life. Violent outbursts? Mira's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. Servants have reported that he becomes uncontrollable during storms. The second man added, clearly pleased to be delivering damaging testimony. Breaking furniture, shouting at shadows, behaving in ways that would terrify any reasonable woman. "That is enough," Garran said sharply, rising from his chair with barely controlled fury. "You will not speak of my private struggles as if they were entertainment for your amusement." "Sit down, Sir Garran," Lady Fairfax commanded. "Your reaction only proves our point about your unsuitability for civilized company." "No," Mira said firmly, also rising. "My husband will not sit down, and neither will I. Not while you spread lies and distortions about a man who has served this kingdom with more honor than any of you have shown in this room today." King Aldric raised a hand for silence, his expression troubled. "Lady Mira, please. These are serious concerns." "These are malicious lies," Mira interrupted, her careful court manners finally abandoning her entirely. "Yes, my husband struggles with memories of war. Yes, thunder reminds him of artillery fire and makes him seek open air rather than enclosed spaces. Yes, he has spent years believing himself unsuited for marriage because people like these," she gestured toward the three nobles, "have convinced him that his war wounds make him unworthy of love." She turned to face Lady Fairfax directly, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. "But violent outbursts? Breaking furniture? Terrorizing servants? These are fabrications designed to paint him as a monster, when the truth is that he is the gentlest man I have ever known." "You have been married mere weeks," Lady Fairfax said dismissively. "You cannot possibly understand the full extent of his condition. I understand that he wakes screaming from nightmares about battles fought to protect ungrateful nobles who now use his sacrifice against him. I understand that he practices swordwork each dawn not from bloodlust, but from the discipline that keeps him sane. I understand that he reads poetry and presses flowers and carries his mother's medallion into battle because beneath the armor beats the heart of a man who dreams of peace." The room had gone completely silent, and Mira realized she was trembling with the force of her emotions. Garran stood beside her, staring at her with an expression of wonder and gratitude that made her chest tight with love. "Most importantly," she continued, her voice growing stronger, "I understand that I chose this man freely, with full knowledge of who and what he is. And I would choose him again every day for the rest of my life." "Pretty words," the first nobleman said with a sneer. "But what will you say when the novelty wears off, and you discover the true burden of being wed to such a damaged man?" Before Mira could respond, something extraordinary happened. Garran reached into his tunic and withdrew his mother's medallion, the ancient piece gleaming in the afternoon light that streamed through the chamber's tall windows. "You want to know about my nature?" he said quietly, his voice carrying a resonance that seemed to fill the entire room. "About whether I am fit to be a husband?" He placed the medallion around his neck, and Mira gasped as it began to emit a soft, golden glow that was clearly visible even in daylight. The gemstone at its center pulsed with warm light, and she felt something shift in the very air around them. "This medallion has been in my family for 3 centuries, Garran continued, his voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "It was made by my ancestor for his bride, who was said to possess the gift of seeing into men's hearts. The legend says it glows in the presence of true love, dims in the presence of deception, and burns cold as winter when evil is near." Lady Fairfax had gone pale, and the 2 noblemen were staring at the glowing medallion with expressions of shock and growing fear. "It has been dark my entire life," Garran said, stepping closer to Mira and taking her hand in his, "until the day I met this woman. Since then, it has burned steady and warm, growing brighter each day as our love has deepened." He turned to face their accusers, and in the medallion's light, his scarred features looked noble rather than frightening, touched with an otherworldly beauty that spoke to something ancient and powerful. "You ask if my wife chose me freely, with full knowledge of my nature. Look at the light and judge for yourselves whether our love is real or feigned." The medallion's glow intensified, filling the chamber with golden radiance that seemed to warm the very stones of the walls. In that light, Mira could see truth written on every face, the genuine wonder on King Aldric's features, the growing panic on Lady Fairfax's, the way the two noblemen seemed to shrink back as if burned by the medallion's radiance. "Sorcery," Lady Fairfax whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Truth," King Aldric said firmly, rising from his chair to study the glowing medallion more closely. "I have heard the legends of the Ravenscroft bride gift, though I confess I thought them mere stories." He looked between Mira and Garran, and, when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of a king making a royal pronouncement. "Let it be recorded that the marriage between Sir Garran of Ravenscroft and Lady Mira is valid in the eyes of God and Crown, blessed by love so true that it awakens ancient magic. Any who question this union in future will answer to me personally." Lady Fairfax opened her mouth as if to protest, but the medallion's light flared brighter, and she seemed to think better of whatever she had planned to say. Instead, she offered a stiff curtsy and departed the chamber with as much dignity as she could muster, her two companions trailing behind like beaten dogs. When they were alone with the king, the medallion's glow softened to a warm radiance that cast everything in golden light. King Aldric studied them both with genuine interest, the political mask falling away to reveal simple human curiosity. "How long has it been glowing?" he asked. "Since the first time she touched my hand," Garran admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I thought I was cursed, that my heart raced from some evil influence. I never imagined it might be the opposite, that my body recognized love before my mind could accept it." "And you, Lady Mira? What did you sense when you first touched him?" Mira smiled, remembering that moment in the castle weeks ago when everything had changed. "I felt his heart beating like thunder, and I knew that here was a man capable of loving with his whole being. Not cursed, but blessed with the ability to feel more deeply than most people ever dare." King Aldric nodded slowly, then moved to his desk and lifted a document bearing the royal seal. "The deed to Thornwick Valley, as promised. Your service to the crown has been exemplary, Sir Garran, and your marriage is clearly blessed by forces beyond mortal understanding." As they left the audience chamber, Mira felt the weight of victory earned and love proven. The medallion continued to glow softly against Garran's chest, its light visible through the fabric of his tunic, a constant reminder that some truths were too powerful to be hidden or denied. "Did you know?" she asked as they walked through corridors that no longer seemed hostile. "About the medallion's properties?" "I suspected," Garran admitted, "but I had given up hope of ever seeing it glow. I thought the magic had died with my mother's line. Perhaps it was simply waiting for the right moment. The right love. Perhaps." That evening, as they prepared to return home to Ravenscroft, Mira found herself thinking about the power of truth freely spoken and love honestly acknowledged. They had faced their enemies not with swords or political maneuvering, but with simple honesty about what they meant to each other. As Garran helped her into their traveling cloak, the medallion's gentle radiance casting warm shadows on the walls, Mira knew that whatever challenges awaited them in the future, they would face them as they had learned to face everything else together, with courage and love and the unshakable knowledge that some bonds are strong enough to awaken ancient magic and change the very nature of what seems possible. The confrontation at court had changed something fundamental between them, though it took Mira several days to understand exactly what that change meant. They had returned to Ravenscroft to keep as heroes vindicated, their love proven before King, and court in a way that left no room for doubt or challenge. The medallion had ceased its magical glow once they departed the royal presence, but its brief illumination had transformed their understanding of what they meant to each other. It was Garran who put it into words as they stood together on the battlements 3 mornings after their return, watching the sun rise over the valley that was now officially theirs. "We fought for each other," he said quietly, his voice carrying wonder as if the concept were entirely new to him. Not just defended or protected, but actively chose to stand together against those who would separate us. Is that so surprising? For me, yes. He turned to face her, and in the early light she could see the peace that had settled over his features, replacing the habitual wariness that had defined him for so long. I have spent my entire adult life fighting for abstract concepts, duty, honor, the security of the realm. I never imagined what it would feel like to fight for something personal, something that belonged to me alone. Not alone, Mira corrected gently. To us. To us, he agreed, and the smile that crossed his face was like sunrise itself, bright and warming and full of promise. They had been making changes to the keep since their return. Small alterations that transformed the fortress from a defensive position into something approaching a home. Mira had convinced Garran to move his ancestral sword from the armory to a place of honor above the hearth in their shared solar, where its presence spoke of heritage rather than constant readiness for war. In return, she had set up a small workshop in one of the unused chambers, where she could practice her stonework and create pieces that brought beauty rather than mere function to their daily lives. "Show me what you are working on," Garran said, as they descended from the walls, his curiosity about her craft having grown steadily over the weeks of their marriage. The workshop was her pride, fitted with tools and materials that Willem had somehow procured despite their remote location. Blocks of various stones waited to be shaped, while finished pieces caught the morning light streaming through windows that had been enlarged to provide better illumination for detail work. "This," Mira said, unveiling her current project with the pride of an artist confident in her vision. Garran stared at the half-finished sculpture, his breath catching audibly. The piece was carved from a single block of pale marble, its subject clearly recognizable despite its incomplete state. Two figures stood together, a tall man and a smaller woman, their hands joined and their faces turned toward each other with expressions of such tender devotion that the stone itself seemed to pulse with life. "It is us," he said softly, reaching out to trace the carved lines of the male figure's face with reverent fingers. "It will be when I finish it." I wanted to capture this moment, not our wedding or any formal ceremony, but this feeling of having chosen each other freely and completely. "The detail is extraordinary. You have made stone look like living flesh." Mira moved to stand beside him, studying her work with the critical eye of a master craftsman. Stone has its own life, its own grain and character. My job is simply to reveal what was always there, waiting to be discovered. "Like us? Like us?" The question was asked quietly, but she heard the depth of meaning behind it. Garran was thinking about their own transformation, the way their marriage had revealed aspects of themselves that had been hidden beneath years of careful protection and defensive isolation. "Exactly like us," she agreed. Two people who were already complete individually, but who discovered something extraordinary when we allowed ourselves to be seen clearly by another person. They spent the morning in comfortable companionship, Garran watching with fascination as Mira worked on the intricate details of the sculpture's drapery. He asked thoughtful questions about technique and artistic choice, and she found herself explaining not just the mechanics of carving, but the philosophy behind her approach to the craft. "Each piece of stone has its own personality," she said as she refined the curve of the woman's shoulder. "Some are cooperative, yielding easily to the chisel's guidance. Others are stubborn, requiring patience and persistence to coax them into the desired shape. The secret is learning to work with the stone's nature rather than against it." "And what kind of stone am I?" Garran asked with gentle humor. Mira paused in her carving, considering the question seriously. "You are granite," she said finally. "Strong and enduring, beautiful when properly finished, but requiring great patience and skill to shape. The kind of stone that, once carved, will last for centuries without losing its essential character. And you? Marble. I think. Softer than granite but still durable, capable of taking fine detail and holding it clearly. Marble and granite complement each other well in architecture. The granite provides the foundation and structure, while the marble adds the decorative elements that make a building not just functional but beautiful. They were interrupted by Willem's arrival. The elderly seneschal, bearing the afternoon post and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "My lord, my lady," he said with a formal bow that could not quite hide his pleased smile. "Letters have arrived from the capital. It seems your appearance at court has generated considerable interest." The first letter bore the royal seal and contained an official commendation of Garran's service, along with a formal invitation to serve as an advisor on matters of border security. The language was diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. The king valued his judgment and wished to make use of his expertise in ways that did not require him to leave his new home for extended periods. The second letter was from Lady Margaret Ashworth, the kind noble woman who had spoken with Mira at court. Her note was warm and congratulatory, expressing genuine pleasure at their vindication and extending an invitation to visit her estates in the spring. But it was the third letter that surprised them both, written on expensive parchment and bearing an unfamiliar seal. It proved to be from a young knight named Sir Edmund Blackwater, who had served under Garran's command during the siege that had left such lasting scars on her husband's mind. "My lord," the letter began, "word has reached me of your recent marriage and the courage with which you and your lady defended your union at court. I write to express my admiration and to share news that I hope will bring you some measure of peace. The nightmares that have plagued you since Blackwater were not yours alone to bear. Every man who survived that siege carries similar wounds, and in recent months, several of us have found healing through honest conversation about our shared experiences. We have learned that the memories that haunt us lose some of their power when shared with those who understand their weight. If you would be willing, I would like to organize a gathering of Blackwater veterans here at my estates, not for reminiscence or glory-seeking, but for the kind of honest discussion that allows old wounds to finally heal. Your lady would be most welcome as well, as would any others you trust with such delicate matters. You saved my life during that siege, my lord, and the lives of dozens of others. Perhaps now we can return the favor by helping to save your peace of mind." Garran read the letter twice, his hands trembling slightly as he set it aside. When he looked up at Mira, she saw tears in his eyes, not of pain, but of profound relief. "I thought I was the only one," he said quietly. "All these years I believed. The nightmares and the fear were signs of my own weakness, my inability to bear what stronger men could endure. And now? Now I learn that the strongest men I know have been carrying the same burdens, feeling the same shame, believing the same lies about their own inadequacy." Mira reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers with the easy intimacy that had become second nature. "Will you go?" "To this gathering he proposes. Would you come with me?" "If you want me there?" "I want you everywhere," Garran said simply. "You have taught me that burdens shared are burdens halved, that there is no shame in accepting help when it is offered with genuine care. I would like these men to meet the woman who showed me that healing is possible." That evening, as they composed their response to Sir Edmund's invitation, Mira felt the profound satisfaction that came from witnessing a life transformed. The man who had once believed himself too damaged for love was now reaching out to help other wounded warriors find their own paths to peace. "What changed?" she asked as they sealed the letter that would carry their acceptance to Sir Edmund's gathering. "You," Garran said without hesitation. "You changed everything. You saw past the scars to the man underneath, and in doing so, you taught me to see myself differently. You proved that love is not diminished by imperfection, but strengthened by the courage to reveal our vulnerabilities to someone who will guard them carefully. And what have you learned about yourself?" Garran considered this, his expression thoughtful in the candlelight. That I am not broken, merely wounded. That healing is possible, even from the deepest hurts. That the capacity for love I thought had been destroyed was simply buried, waiting for the right person to call it forth. He stood and moved to the window, looking out over the lands that were now truly theirs, earned not just through service, but through the courage to fight for the right to happiness. Most importantly, he continued, I have learned that I am not meant to walk through this world alone. I have a partner now, someone who stands beside me not from obligation or political necessity, but from choice freely made and renewed each day. Mira joined him at the window, slipping easily into the circle of his arms as they looked out over their domain together. In the distance, lights flickered in the village windows, marking the homes of families who slept peacefully because men, like Garran, stood ready to defend them. What do you see when you look out there now? She asked. Home, he said simply. Not just a place to defend or a responsibility to bear, but a home to share with the woman I love, a future to build together, stone by stone, day by day. The medallion, which had taken to glowing softly whenever they were alone together, pulsed with warm light against his chest. Its magic had become part of their daily lives, a constant reminder that their love was something rare and precious, blessed by forces beyond mortal understanding. But more than the magic, more than the royal recognition or the lands they had been granted, what mattered most was the quiet certainty that they had found in each other exactly what they had not even dared to hope for. Not just love, but understanding. Not just partnership, but the deep peace that came from being truly known and accepted without reservation. Tomorrow they would begin planning for Sir Edmund's gathering, taking the first steps toward healing wounds that had festered in isolation for too long. They would continue the patient work of transforming a fortress into a home, a marriage of convenience into something approaching legend. But tonight, they stood together in the growing darkness, watching over the valley that would shelter their love and nurture their dreams, content in the knowledge that some stories, when told with enough courage and honesty, really do end with happiness ever after. The gathering at Sir Edmund's estate took place on a crisp day in late autumn, when the leaves had turned to gold and crimson, and the air carried the promise of winter's approach. Mira stood beside Garran as they approached the modest manor house, noting the way his shoulders had gradually relaxed during their journey as anticipation replaced anxiety. 7 men had answered Edmund's invitation knights and soldiers who had served under Garran's command during the siege of Blackwater, their faces weathered by years and marked by the same shadows that had haunted her husband. But when they saw Garran approaching, their expressions transformed into something approaching reverence. "My lord," Sir Edmund said, stepping forward with a warm smile. "It has been too long, Edmund." Garran's voice was rough with emotion as he embraced the younger knight. "You look well, better than I have in years, thanks to conversations like the one we hope to have today." Edmund turned to Mira with genuine courtesy. "My lady, welcome. Your husband spoke truly when he said you were remarkable." The gathering took place in Edmund's private study, a comfortable room lined with books and warmed by a generous fire. As the men settled into chairs arranged in a rough circle, Mira noticed the way they unconsciously positioned themselves, alert, watchful, even in this safe space, carrying the habits of men who had learned that danger could strike without warning. "I asked you here," Edmund began, "because I realized that we have been carrying our burdens alone for too long. The siege of Blackwater marked all of us, but we have pretended otherwise, believing that silence was strength and that admitting our struggles would diminish our honor." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the circle, and Mira saw several men nod with the recognition of shared experience. "Captain," said a grizzled sergeant whose scarred hands bore testament to years of warfare, "speaking for myself, I never knew how to put words to what I felt after that siege. Still don't, mostly. But the nightmares, they come every few months, regular as taxes. The thunder, added another man quietly. Can't abide it anymore. Makes me feel like I'm back in those trenches, waiting for the next bombardment. One by one, they began to share their stories, not the heroic versions they might tell in taverns, but the honest, painful truth of what it meant to survive when friends did not, to carry the weight of command when every decision might mean life or death for the men under your protection. Garran listened with growing amazement as these men he respected and admired revealed struggles identical to his own. The shame he had carried for years, the belief that his nightmares and storm fears marked him as wheat began to crumble under the weight of shared experience. I thought I was the only one, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought the others had moved past it, had found some strength I lacked. We all thought that, Edmund replied. We looked at each other and saw only the face we presented to the world, never the private battles we fought in the dark hours before dawn. But how do you bear it? Asked the youngest of the group, a man who could not have been more than 25. How do you function when every loud noise sends you back to that place? It was Mira who answered, speaking for the first time since the gathering began. You bear it by refusing to bear it alone. You share the weight with people who understand its shape and substance. You stop pretending that strength means suffering in silence. The men turned to her with expressions of surprise and growing interest, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. My husband spent years believing that his struggles made him unfit for love, unworthy of partnership, she continued. He carried his burdens alone because he thought that was what honor demanded. But there is no honor in needless suffering, and there is no shame in accepting help when it is offered with genuine care. And how, asked the sergeant, does a woman understand such things? Not questioning your wisdom, my lady, just curious about your perspective. Mira smiled, thinking of the comparison she had made between working stone and healing hearts. I am a craftsman by trade, skilled in the art of taking something rough and damaged and revealing the beauty that lies beneath the surface. I know that the strongest materials often require the most patient work, and that the most magnificent structures are built through collaboration rather than solitary effort. She looked around the circle, seeing the way her words were being received. Processed, considered by men who had spent too long believing themselves beyond repair. Your captain, my husband, is one of the strongest men I have ever known, she said firmly. Not because he has never been wounded, but because he has learned to seek healing. Not because he has never felt fear, but because he continues to act with courage despite that fear. His willingness to be vulnerable, to admit his struggles and accept help, is not a sign of weakness but of profound strength. The conversation that followed lasted well into the afternoon, as 7 battle-hardened warriors gradually began to dismantle the walls they had built around their pain. They shared practical strategies for managing nightmares and anxiety, discussed the importance of finding trusted confidants, and made tentative plans for future gatherings. But more than the specific techniques they exchanged, what mattered was the recognition that they were not alone, that their struggles were neither unique nor shameful, and that healing was possible even from the deepest wounds. As they prepared to depart, Sir Edmund pulled Garran aside for a private word. Captain, he said quietly, I want you to know that your courage in admitting your struggles has given the rest of us permission to seek our own healing. The man who led us through Blackwater was a hero, but the man who has learned to be vulnerable in pursuit of wholeness, that man is something even greater. The journey home was quiet, both of them processing the day's revelations in their own ways. As their carriage rolled through countryside painted in autumn's brilliant colors, Mira reached for Garran's hand, noting the way his fingers intertwined with hers had become as natural as breathing. How do you feel? She asked softly. Lighter, he said after a moment's consideration. As if I have been carrying a burden so long I forgot it was there, until suddenly the weight was lifted and I could stand straight again. And the nightmares? The fear of storms? Still there, I suspect. Healing is not the same as forgetting. And I would not want to forget entirely. Those memories are part of what makes me cautious enough to keep good men alive. He turned to look at her, his expression peaceful in a way she had never seen before. But now I know I do not have to face them alone. I have you, and I have brothers who understand, and that changes everything. That evening, as they settled into their familiar routine at Ravenscroft Keep, Mira felt the deep satisfaction that came from witnessing transformation. The man who had once believed himself too damaged for love had spent the day helping other wounded warriors find their own paths toward healing. "There is something I want to show you," Garran said as they prepared for bed, his voice carrying a note of shy anticipation that she had learned to associate with his most precious revelations. He led her to his study, where he had been working on correspondence related to his new advisory role with the King's Council. But instead of showing her official documents, he lifted a leather-bound book from his desk, a journal, she realized, with pages covered in his careful handwriting. "I have been writing," he said simply, "about Blackwater, about the years since, about what it means to carry such memories and still try to build a life worth living. I thought, if Edmund is right about the healing power of shared experience, perhaps other veterans could benefit from reading about one man's journey toward wholeness." Mira took the journal with reverent hands, feeling the weight of courage it represented. "You would publish this? Share your most private struggles with strangers? With men who might recognize their own struggles in mine, yes. If my pain can be transformed into something that helps others find healing, then perhaps it was not meaningless after all." She opened the book to a random page, reading words that spoke of nightmares and shame, of the slow discovery that vulnerability could be strength, of the transformative power of love offered without conditions or expectations. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "Honest and painful and hopeful all at once. Like you, like us," he corrected. "Much of it is about learning to accept love, to believe that I was worthy of partnership despite my wounds. You are on every page, even when you are not mentioned by name." As they settled into bed that night, the journal resting on the table beside Mira's pressed flowers and other treasured keepsakes, she reflected on the day's significance. They had witnessed the power of shared truth to heal old wounds, had seen strong men give each other permission to be human, had discovered that the greatest battles were sometimes fought not with swords, but with the courage to be authentically vulnerable. The medallion pulsed with its familiar warm light against Garran's chest as he drew her into his arms, its magic a constant reminder that their love was something rare and precious. But magic, she had learned, was not limited to ancient artifacts and glowing gems. There was magic in the choice to trust another person with your deepest fears. Magic in the decision to stand together against a world that would divide you. Magic in the daily renewal of vows made not from obligation, but from love freely given. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to grow in understanding and devotion. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of a man who had learned to believe in his own worthiness of love, Mira knew that some transformations were so complete, so fundamental, that they changed not just individual lives, but the very definition of what seemed possible. In the morning, she would return to her sculpture, adding the final touches that would capture not just their faces, but the essence of what they had become together. The stone would endure for centuries, a testament to the truth that love, when built on foundations of honesty and mutual respect, could withstand any storm and emerge stronger for having weathered it together. Spring arrived early at Ravenscroft Keep, painting the valley in shades of green so vivid they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Mira stood in the garden where she and Garran had shared their first breakfast as husband and wife, one hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly where their child grew beneath her heart. 6. Months had passed since the gathering at Edmund's estate. 6 months of gradual healing and deepening love that had transformed not just their marriage, but their understanding of what two people could become when they chose to face life's challenges together. The nightmares still came occasionally, but they were gentler now, and Garran no longer faced them alone. When thunder rolled across the valley, he might still step outside for air, but Mira was always beside him, her presence an anchor that kept him grounded in the present rather than lost in the past. "The roses are blooming early," Garran observed as he joined her in the garden, his hand settling over hers on the small mound of their growing child. His touch was gentle, reverent, filled with wonder at the life they had created together. "Everything blooms early when it is properly loved," Mira replied, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. "Plants, people, dreams, they all respond to care and attention. And what of our little one? How does he fare today?" "She is quite active this morning," Mira corrected with gentle humor. "I suspect she will have her father's restless energy and her mother's stubborn determination. A formidable combination. Indeed, the kingdom should prepare itself." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher over the valley that had become more than home. It had become sanctuary, a place where love had been allowed to take root and flourish without interference from the outside world. Mira thought of the sculpture she had finally completed the previous month, now displayed in their solar as a testament to the journey they had traveled together. The carved figures seemed to breathe with life, their stone faces radiant with the kind of joy that could only come from love freely chosen and honestly expressed. "The midwife says it will be soon," she said softly, feeling the familiar flutter of movement beneath her ribs. "Perhaps another month, no more. Are you frightened?" Mira considered the question seriously. Fear seemed too small a word for the complex emotions that accompanied impending motherhood. Anticipation and wonder mixed with the sobering knowledge that their lives were about to change in ways they could not fully predict or control. "I am awed," she said finally, "humbled by the magnitude of what we are about to undertake, but not frightened. No. How can I be frightened when I have you beside me, when I know our child will be born into a house filled with love and laughter, and the security that comes from parents who chose each other completely?" Garran's arms tightened around her, and she felt the familiar race of his heartbeat that had once been mistaken for curse, but had proven to be blessing. The medallion, which had taken to glowing more brightly as her pregnancy progressed, pulsed with warm light that seemed to embrace all three of them, mother, father, and child not yet born but already beloved. "I used to fear that any child of mine would inherit my curses," Garran confessed quietly, "that they would be condemned to the same isolation and struggle that marked my early years. And now I know that what I mistook for curses were simply gifts that had not yet found their proper purpose. Our child will inherit strength and the capacity for deep feeling, intuition that borders on magic, and the knowledge that love is worth fighting for. These are not burdens but blessings." They were interrupted by Willem's approach, the elderly seneschal moving with careful steps across the garden path. He carried a small bundle in his arms, soft wool knitted in shades of cream and pale yellow, suitable for a child of either gender. "From Meredith," he said, with a smile that made his weathered face glow with grandfatherly pride. "She has been working on this for months, though she pretended it was merely kitchen towels whenever anyone asked." Mira accepted the bundle with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. The blanket was exquisite, knitted with a pattern of intertwining roses and oak leaves that spoke of love and strength, beauty and endurance. The stitches were so tiny and perfect that they resembled fine lacework, each one placed with the careful attention of someone who understood that this child would be precious beyond measure. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Please tell Meredith that it will be treasured. She knows, my lady. We all know." Willem's expression grew serious, his voice carrying the weight of years and deep affection. If I may be permitted to speak freely, the household has watched your love story unfold with wonder and joy. To see our Lord transformed from a man who believed himself unworthy of happiness into someone who radiates contentment and hope has been a privilege to witness. We have all been transformed, Garran said quietly. Love changes everyone it touches, not just those who give and receive it directly. As Willem departed to oversee the afternoon's household activities, Mira found herself thinking about transformation and legacy, about the ways that one couple's choice to love honestly and completely could ripple outward to touch lives they might never directly encounter. Garran's journal had been quietly published the previous winter, distributed not through commercial channels, but through the informal networks that connected veterans throughout the kingdom. Letters had begun arriving within weeks, grateful words from men who recognized their own struggles in his honest account. Requests for advice from those still trapped in isolation and shame. Expressions of hope from wives and families who finally understood that their loved ones' invisible wounds could be healed with patience and care. Edmund wrote again, Garran said, seeming to read her thoughts. 3 more veterans have requested inclusion in our gatherings. Word is spreading that healing is possible, that there is no shame in seeking help. And you? How do you feel about becoming a symbol of hope for so many? Garran considered this, his expression thoughtful, honored, humbled, occasionally overwhelmed by the responsibility, but mostly grateful that my pain can be transformed into something useful, something that might spare others from years of unnecessary suffering. That is the mark of true healing, Mira observed. When our wounds become wells from which we can draw compassion for others who struggle with similar burdens. As afternoon faded into evening, they made their way inside for dinner, moving with the unhurried pace of people who had learned to savor simple pleasures. The great hall had been transformed over the months of their marriage, warmed by tapestries that Mira had commissioned from local weavers, brightened by fresh flowers from their garden, made welcoming by the addition of smaller tables that encouraged intimate conversation rather than formal dining. Tonight, they dined alone as had become their custom, sharing the day's small events and larger thoughts in the companionable intimacy of 2 people who had learned to be completely themselves with each other. The medallion's gentle glow provided warm light that made everything seem touched with magic. While beyond the windows, spring rain began to fall in the soft patter that promised growth and renewal. "What are you thinking about?" Garran asked, noting her contemplative expression. "Beginnings," Mira replied. "The way our story started with a woman willing to risk everything for the chance at love, and a man brave enough to hope that he might be worthy of such a gift. And what is our story now? Now, it is about 2 people who discovered that love is not a destination, but a daily choice, not a state of being, but an ongoing creation. We wake each morning and choose each other again, choose to build something beautiful together, choose to face whatever challenges come with honesty and courage and the unshakable knowledge that we are stronger together than we could ever be apart." Garran reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb tracing the wedding ring that had become as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. "And what will our story become when the baby arrives? Richer, more complex, filled with the kind of love that expands to encompass new hearts without diminishing what came before." She smiled, feeling the child stir in response to their joined hands. "We will teach our children what we have learned, that strength comes from vulnerability, that healing is possible from even the deepest wounds, that love freely chosen and honestly expressed can transform not just individual lives, but the very nature of what seems possible." Later, as they prepared for bed in the chamber they now shared openly and joyfully, Mira caught sight of herself in the mirror and marveled at the woman she had become. Gone was the cautious, guarded craftsman who had once believed that independence meant isolation. In her place stood someone radiant with love and confidence, secure in the knowledge that she had chosen well and been chosen in return. No regrets? Garran asked softly, following her gaze to their reflection, the giant knight and his wife, no longer separated by fear or misunderstanding, but united in purpose and devotion. Only one, Mira replied with a teasing smile. I regret that it took us so long to find each other. Perhaps we found each other exactly when we were ready, Garran suggested. When we had learned enough about ourselves to recognize what we needed in a partner. When we had grown brave enough to risk vulnerability for the chance at genuine connection. As they settled into bed, Mira felt the deep peace that came from a life lived authentically and love embraced without reservation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. The ongoing work of building a marriage and preparing for parenthood. The daily choices that transformed intention into reality. But tonight, wrapped in the arms of a man who had learned to believe in his own worthiness of love, feeling their child move beneath her heart while the medallion's ancient magic blessed their union with gentle radiance. Mira knew that some stories really did end with happiness ever after, not because life became perfect, but because two people had found the courage to face life's imperfections together, to choose love over fear, vulnerability over isolation, hope over despair. In a garden outside their window, the roses they had planted together swayed in the spring rain, their roots growing deeper with each passing season, their blooms more beautiful for having weathered winter's trials. Like love itself, they were strongest when they had learned to bend without breaking, to find nourishment even in difficult seasons, to trust that patient tending would always yield the most magnificent results. The rain continued to fall, gentle and nurturing, washing the world clean and preparing it for whatever wonders the new season might bring.